Some of you might be familiar with the work of Kehinde Wiley. Um, if you've seen the official presidential portrait of Obama that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery with all other presidential portraits, you're already familiar with his work. And you also read for this week a short New York Times article about what Wiley has been up to most recently and his thoughts on art, protest, and activism from this year. Wiley uses what he calls street casting to find his models. And here the model for Judith and Holofernes is a woman named Trisha Lowe, who worked as a prison guard at Rikers Island. He found her in a mall in downtown Brooklyn. And he positions her as Judith, the Old Testament heroine. And Judith is she is a widow who goes to the Assyrian general Holofernes under the guise of helping him to defeat the Jews. He falls asleep. She decapitates him with his own sword, and the town celebrates. Judith and Holofernes, this is a common subject in Baroque art, and here Wiley translates this, this classic biblical story of courage and power into a contemporary version that resonates with fury and anger. Look at that face. Look at the expression there of kind of self-assuredness, poise, holding the decapitated head of Holofernes. I think that this portrait has even more power behind it when we think about recent developments in the Black Lives Matter movement and the social justice movements in the US. Wiley, what is typical for his portraits, including the portrait of Obama here, is the ornate floral pattern that kind of swirls behind and over the body instead of some sort of narrative background. Olu Oguibe is a Nigerian-born artist and art historian who lives and works in the United States. And this is his contribution to the Documenta exhibition in Kassel. Documenta happens every 4 years in this little town in Germany. And it is really, every 5 years. And it is really the major exhibition of contemporary art. It is a place that is incredibly important for contemporary artists. And he decides to erect a monument outside of the exhibition halls. And he erects here an obelisk. Think about the Washington Monument. It's the monument for strangers and refugees, and it's right in the middle of town on the Königsplatz, this big kind of open square. On each side of the obelisk is a quote from the New Testament biblical book of Matthew that reads, "I was a stranger and you took me in." And each side is in a different language: German, Arabic, English, and Turkish. There is a large Turkish immigrant population in Germany. And Oguibe himself had survived the Nigerian civil wars of the late 60s and early 70s, and he wanted to speak to the rise of anti-immigrant bigotry and political rhetoric, the rise of alt-right political groups and pundits over the past 5 years, and instead acknowledge the life-saving hospitality and refuge which some countries have offered to people fleeing war and violence, just as he did as a young child. Germany, the site of the Documenta, took over 1 million refugees in the last decade, and Many refugees fleeing Iraq, Syria, elsewhere, and this led to a growth in anti-immigration parties throughout Europe. So this work is really evoking and materializing this crisis of humanity and is a call to action. All right, we're going to really jump to some most recent work and controversies and talk about the Whitney Biennial from last year. The major controversy of this show, and we see some images of protests here, is has to do with the board of the Whitney Museum of American Art. And the Whitney Biennial, hosted by this museum, is again another major showcase for contemporary art that happens every other year. Warren B. Kanders is the vice president of the board, who runs a company that sells tear gas and other law enforcement supplies that were used at the United States-Mexico border against migrants and refugees. And there was a call for Kanders to step down because of those sales. In fact, here we see some protests at the opening of the show, but even before the show opened, Michael Rakowitz and others pulled out of the exhibition in protest of Mr. Kanders' involvement with the museum. What we're looking at here is an earlier exhibit, an earlier installation by Rakowitz called A Color Removed. Rakowitz makes conceptual art projects that focus on vulnerable people and communities. And this is an installation in Cleveland that focused on the killing of 12-year-old Tamir Rice by Cleveland police officers. And here, the color he has removed is orange, a color that often signifies safety or a warning, and connecting it to the idea that Black children, Black people in the United States are often not safe no matter what they do. So he didn't want to align himself with an institution associated with Kanders and the sale of tear gas and other weapons to be used at the border. And he said, quote, "I feel like I'd be betraying everything I ever cared about in the work that I make. You wouldn't compromise the integrity of a work on paper by showing it in unsafe conditions. You should not compromise the integrity of an artist and ask them to show with funding and permission that from people that make conditions unsafe for others." End quote. What eventually happens is that Kanders steps down, but this brings up, I think, a much an important larger debate that is raging today about museums, politics, and sources of their fundings. In fact, the Metropolitan Museum of Art has stopped accepting gifts from members of the Sackler family. They are associated with the big pharmaceutical company that makes OxyContin, and they deliberately concealed the addictive potential of OxyContin and other opioids. All right, the final video, we're going to focus on the work of Kara Walker.